cities is rife with stories of sights of ghosts and spirits. Its long and sordid history combined with human habitation is the perfect spot for many a dark tale. A tale of two cities, London was and still is the playground of the wealthy, while harboring the poorest. As a result, crime was rife and danger was at every corner. While bright young things danced with mirth, dark creatures lurked in the shadows, waiting to corrupt. In Regency times, it was said that once an innocent went to London, they didn't leave as one. It's no surprise, then, that London is the home to hundreds of stories of ghosts, even on the odd occasion, a demon or two. Our first stop on our list of ghost stories of London is a rather unremarkable-looking pub. Unremarkable, perhaps, but the Grenadiers pub is a wonderfully atmospheric drinking establishment in Wilton Row. It was originally built in 1720 as an officers' mess for the Senior Infantry Regiment of the British Army, the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards, and so was located in a courtyard of their barracks. It was opened to the public in 1818 as the Guardsman and was subsequently renamed in honour of the Grenadier Guards action in the Battle of Waterloo. Wilton Row is a tucked-away mews where time has well and truly stood still. The Grenadier is a tiny pub which has long enjoyed a reputation as one of the most haunted pubs in London. On one of its walls, yellowed newspapers tell of the pub's haunted history, and a small crucifix hangs on a wall of the cellar to ward off harmful spirits or energies. Wilton Mews is a delightfully hidden nooks that is tucked away from the rush of modern London and has a decidedly country village air about it. Colourful cottages line the cobblestones, and nestling within its tranquil serenity is one of London's most enchanting pubs, the Grenadier. Reputedly, the pub's upper floors were once used as the officers' mess of a nearby barracks, whilst its cellar was pressed into service as a drinking and gambling lair for the common soldiers. Here, a young subaltern is said to have once been caught cheating at cards, and his comrades punished him with such a severe beating that he died from his injuries. Although the year in which this occurred is not known, the month when it happened is thought to have been September, as this is when the pub experiences an onslaught of supernatural activity. A solemn, silent spectre has been seen moving slowly across the low-ceilinged rooms. Objects either disappear or else are mysteriously moved overnight. Unseen hands rattle tables and chairs, and a strange, icy chill has been known to hang in the air, sometimes for days on end. Footsteps have been heard pacing anxiously around empty rooms, whilst every so often a low sighing moan has been heard emanating from the depths of the cellar. On one occasion, a chief superintendent of New Scotland Yard was enjoying a drink in the pub when wisps of smoke began to waft around him. His curiosity aroused, he reached towards the apparent source of the smoke and with a cry of pain pulled his hand quickly back as an invisible cigarette burnt it. It is without doubt a special place, but it begs to be known, to be properly understood, not just as a famous or infamous. The Grenadier has a soul all of its own. I feel I could help fill an historical void, or at least as an eyewitness, could possibly lend some reality and perhaps even some credibility to some of the myths that prevail, rather than fuel the Chinese whispers that continue to distort historical truths. Apart from hearing many of Tom's anecdotes, I had my own experiences of Cedric the Ghost and was present in '92 when BBC's 6 o'clock show did a piece on London's most haunted pubs, in the aftermath of which we were visited by many strange phenomena of the not-so-paranormal kind. On one busy winter's night, 8:30 p.m., I had occasion to go to the cellar to fetch some cigars. At the foot of the cellar steps to the left was a wooden lockup about the size of a garden shed that served as the spirit and tobacco store. Built into a corner of the cellar, this structure comprised 2 wooden walls and 2 brick walls, one of which featured the aforementioned tunnel. One busy night, it was almost impossible to get a fag break, so I would sometimes keep a cigarette in a glass ashtray in the lockup and sneak a couple of drags when possible, as I did on this occasion. As if from nowhere, Bobby, the landlord's friendly black cat, appeared. This was unusual in itself, as he wasn't allowed out of their flat during opening hours, let alone allowed to roam the cellars. As I stood puffing quickly on my ciggy, several things happened in very rapid succession. The temperature plummeted. Bobby arched his back and sunk teeth and claws into my leg above the ankle, and the ashtray, which is on a chest-high shelf to my left, flew past my head and smashed with significant force against the wall beside the bricked-up tunnel. I felt a bone-deep chill of fear that I have seldom experienced since, and needless to say, exited the cellar at the velocity of a Polaris missile. At the top of the cellar steps, back in the warm ambience of the restaurant, I felt kind of silly. Maybe I imagined it. As I stepped behind the bar, my boss said, "Are you alright, Graham? You look like you've seen a ghost." The Grenadier was featured on BBC TV's The 6 o'clock show. The crew duly arrived to set up during the afternoon, and the pub staff were primed to go about their duties as normal. The show was sent out live, so it was about 5:30 p.m. and pitch dark outside. The BBC crew had set up some green lighting to lend some eerie atmospherics, all of which took place to the bemusement of our early evening customers. The event was also being recorded by some reporters from Grand Met's in-house magazine. A couple of weeks later, we had a visit from the magazine's photographer, who brought in some stills of the event. He showed us some shots taken from the restaurant entrance, right side as you look at the bar, taken in the front window and side door to Old Barrack Yard. He pointed out a fuzzy image in one of the window panes that vaguely resembled a face. Cynically, it was pointed out that A, there was a tree and vines outside the window, and this could be a trick of the light projected by the large outside lantern, and B, although from inside the height of the window pane in question is less than 6 foot, those that know the Grenadier will be aware that from the ground outside in Wilton Row, the window height is more like 12 to 15 foot. The photographer had been equally cynical and had blown up and zoomed the photo, expecting the image to disperse into a bunch of leaves and light. To his astonishment and ours, the face became even clearer than before. Though still vague, once more the photographer had zoomed in until the small window pane filled the 8-inch by 10-inch photograph, and there, in all its glory, was the face of a man. It was a young man, sporting a dark handlebar mustache and wearing what appeared to be a fez-like hat. The face was at 3/4 to the pane and appeared to be looking straight at the photographer. Of several shots taken from the same perspective, only one captured this doleful image. The detention house closed its doors to the public in 2000 when Customs and Excise boarded the place up to the management's failure to pay their VAT. The prison had seen years of neglect, but in some ways, this neglect lent it a truly creepy atmosphere that more polished haunted venues would kill for. Indeed, as you make your way through its grim depths, it's said you'd often feel cobwebs brushing against your face, and these, coupled with the constant smell of damp, really did add to its sinister, creepy ambience. There's been a prison on this site since 1616, although the series of tunnels and passageways date from its last rebuilding in 1844. It stood on Bowling Green Lane, conveniently close to the Middlesex Sessions House, where prisoners would be tried, on Clerkenwell Green to the south. The House of Detention was built on the site of two earlier prisons, the Clerkenwell Bridewell for convicted prisoners and the new prison for those awaiting trial. The Bridewell closed in 1794, and its functions were taken over by the Coldbath Fields Prison at Mount Pleasant. The new prison was rebuilt in 1818 and in 1847, at which time its name changed to the House of Detention. On the 13th of December, 1867, its exercise yard was the target of a gunpowder explosion, instigated by the members of the Fenian Society in an attempt to aid the escape of Richard O'Sullivan Burke, an arms supplier to the Fenians. The blast killed 12 bystanders and wounded 120 in Corporation Row, and the event became known as the Clerkenwell Outrage. Some of those responsible were executed, with ringleader Michael Barrett becoming the last person to be publicly executed outside Newgate Prison. The prison was demolished in 1890. The site was then used for the Hugh Middleton School, built in 1893 and closed in about 1960. The school building has now been converted into flats. The 9,000 square foot vaults beneath, dating from the prison era and known as the Clerkenwell Catacombs, remained. They were reopened as air raid shelters during the Blitz. Descending a clanking set of iron stairs, you'd pass under a grim replica of a grotesque head, which apparently used to hang over the entrance of the House of Detention. Its mouth hung wide open in terror. It had sunken eyes and matted hair, all of which were meant to symbolize criminal despair. Stepping into a sinister ventilation corridor, you were at once struck by the musty smell of damp and age. As you progressed through this cavernous world of silent shadows, you were at once struck by an intense feeling of utter melancholy. The floor beneath your feet was uneven and worn, whilst ice-cold moisture dripped from above. As you proceeded through the perpetual twilight of this eerie world of silent shadow, you were accompanied by a constant and unnerving feeling that you were being watched by an unseen presence. Indeed, there were sections of the old prison in which you found yourself almost reluctant to turn a corner for fear of who or what might be waiting to greet you. This feeling of being under observation increased with every step taken through the cobweb corridors of the location, and given the fact that many visitors came back from their tour telling of ghostly encounters, there was every chance that you were being watched. Many visitors to the prison caught sight of a shadowy figure moving swiftly through the darkness ahead of them. Others returned from the cells and grim passages, asking who the old lady was, who seemed to be searching for something. They always commented that she would never respond should they offer her assistance, but instead would look up and then simply melt away into thin air. Managers of the place lost count of the number of people who heard the heart-rending sobs of a little girl reverberating from the inner depth of the jail. They genuinely believed that a lost child is wandering the dank maze of corridors and passageways one of the form managers told me in 1996, and when I was carrying out research for my book, Walking Haunted London. When I pressed him a little further for information as to the invisible girl's likely identity, he simply shook his head before attempting an explanation. Children were imprisoned here, and the anguish they suffered must have been terrible. Perhaps this little girl's grief has somehow impregnated the stone, and some people are just sensitive to that sort of thing. In addition, there was the revenant of a particular individual who was very unpleasant and who was known to stalk women who wandered alone through the maze of tunnels. The church lies on the west side of the road between Bishopsgate and near London Street Station. The church and street both take their name from the Bishopsgate in London's defensive wall, which stood approximately 500 meters to the south. Stowe, writing in 1598, described the church of its time as standing in a fair church well adjoining to the town ditch. Upon the very bank thereof, the city ditch was a defensive feature that lay immediately outside the walls and was intended to make attack on the walls by an escalade more difficult. The church was one of 4 in medieval London dedicated to Saint Botolph, a 7th century East Anglian saint, each of which stood by one of the gates of the city. The other 3 were neighbour St. Botolph's Aldgate, St. Botolph's Aldersgate in the west, and St. Botolph's Billingsgate by the river. This church was destroyed by the Great Fire and not rebuilt. Before the legend of St. Christopher became popular, Botolph was veneered as the patron saint of travellers, which is thought to be why churches at the city gates have this dedication. The first known written record of this church is from 1212. However, it is thought that Christian worship on the site may have Roman origins, though this is not fully proven. The church survived the Great Fire of London in 1666 and was rebuilt in 1729. In around 1307, the Knights Templar were examined here by an inquisition on charges of corruption, and in 1413 a female hermit was recorded as living here, supported by a pension of 40 shillings a year paid by the sheriff. Writing in 1708, Hatton described it as an old church built of brick and stone and rendered over. By this time the Gothic church had been altered with the addition of Tuscan columns supporting the roof. In 1982, photographer Chris Brackley took a picture inside this historic old church. The only people present were himself and his wife. When the photograph was developed, he was astonished to note that a woman in an old-fashioned garb was standing on the balcony to the right of the altar. The negative was subjected to considerable expert analysis, which revealed that there was no double exposure to the film, and it was also proved that none of Chris's equipment was faulty. The only explanation for the mysterious figure was that someone must have actually been standing on the balcony when the picture was taken. A few years later, Chris was contacted by a builder who had been employed on restoration work at St. Botolph's crypt. He explained that in knocking down a wall, he had inadvertently disturbed a pile of old coffins. One had come open to reveal a reasonably well-preserved body, the face of which bore an uncanny resemblance to the figure that had made an uninvited appearance in the photograph. On November 2nd, 1811, Philip Whitehead, a man of genial appearance, had been employed in the cashier's office at the Bank of England, was brought to the dock of the Old Bailey charged with forgery. Found guilty, he was sentenced to death and was duly hung in early 1812. News of his crime and execution was, however, kept from his devoted sister, Sarah Whitehead, who was removed by Philip's friends to a house in Wine Office Court off Fleet Street. But one day, Sarah turned up at the Bank of England to inquire of her brother's whereabouts, and an unthinking clerk promptly blurted out the story of Philip's crime and death. The shock of the discovery turned the poor woman's mind, and thereafter she took to turning up at the bank every day, asking after her brother in the belief that he still worked there. She became known as the Bank Nun on account of her peculiar attire that consisted of a long black dress and a black crepe veil worn over her face and head. The city merchants took pity on her and never let her pass without extending their assistance, whilst the directors and the clerks of the Bank of England saw to it that she was frequently provided with sums of money in compliment of her misfortune. But she became convinced that the bank governors were keeping an immense fortune from her, and this led to her frequently hurling insults at them during business hours. On one occasion, Baron Rothschild was going about his business at the stock exchange when she suddenly appeared and called him a villain and a robber, telling him he had defrauded her of her fortune and demanded the 2,000 he owed her. He responded by taking half a crown from his waistcoat pocket, handing it to her and telling her as he did so, "There then, take that and don't bother me now. I'll give you the other half tomorrow." Accepting the money, she thanked him and went away. By 1818, the bank governors had grown tired of her daily disturbances, and so gave her a sum of money on condition she agreed never to return to the bank again. In life, she kept that contract, but in death her wrath has broken it many times. Indeed, more than one late-night wanderer, wending their weary way home along Threadneedle Street, has been surprised by her ghostly figure appearing before them with downcast eyes, inquiring sadly, though politely, "Have you seen my brother?" In the 1860s, Victorian tea trader Frederick Horniman began collecting specimens and artifacts from around the globe with the express intention of bringing the world to Forest Hill. To that end, in 1890, he began opening his house to the public 3 times a week. In 1898, his house was demolished and Charles Harrison Townsend constructed a new museum in the Art Nouveau style. The new museum opened in 1901 and was granted a free gift to the people of London for their recreation and their enjoyment for evermore. The museum is still thriving and makes a wonderful outing. Visitors may also have the opportunity to make the acquaintance of the ghostly man and woman that haunt the terrace at the rear end of the museum to the side of the conservatory. Who they are, no one knows for certain, although there is general consensus from witness that their dress sense is of the 1920s. The man's hair is heavily greased back, and the woman's most notable feature is the bright red dress that she wears. They appear to be enjoying some long-ago garden party or ball, but those who encounter them are most emphatic that they are dancing across the terrace, although no music is ever heard. After a few moments, the waltzing wraiths spin their way into the trees and are gone. 50 Berkeley Square has a long-held reputation as being the most haunted house in London. According to Charles Harper, in his book Haunted Houses, published in 1913, the haunted house in Berkeley Square was long one of those that no country cousin comes up from the provinces to London on sightseeing bent ever witnessed, ever willingly missed. Harper goes on to say that But truth to tell, its exterior is now a trifle disappointing to the casual seeker after horrors viewed in the afternoon sunshine, with the milkman delivering the usual half pint or quart. As the case may be, is just a respectably commonplace as any other house of similar late Georgian period, and even at the weird stroke of 12, when the midnight policeman comes and thrusts a burly shoulder against the front door and tries the area gate, or flashes a gleam over the kitchen windows from his bullseye, there is nothing at all hair-raising about it. But there was a time, Harper continues, when number 50 wore an exceedingly uncared-for appearance. Soap, paint, and whitewash were unused for years, and grime clung to brickwork and windows alike. The area was choked with wasted handbills, wisps of straw, and all the accumulations that speedily made a derelict London house the very picture of misery, and every passing stranger stopped the first errand boy and asked various questions, to which the answer was generally "haunted house." Or if the question happened to be "who lives there?", the obvious reply was "ghostes." It should be noted, however, that Harper himself begins his article with the warning that the house is no longer haunted or even empty. He goes on to say that there was those who declared it was never haunted, and that the story was indeed invented by a popular novelist of years ago. Harper's dismissal notwithstanding, the house certainly acquired something of a sinister reputation, and visitors to London still make the pilgrimage to Berkeley Square to seek out what they often refer to as the most haunted house in London. Number 50 Berkeley Square was once the home of George Canning, a former Prime Minister until his death in 1827. It was then leased to a Miss Curzon, who lived in it up until her death at the ripe old age of 90. It was then occupied by a Mr. Myers, and it was with his tenancy that the house's sinister reputation apparently began. The story goes he was due to be married and had furnished the house in a manner befitting his forthcoming and changing domestic circumstances. But shortly before the wedding, his bride-to-be jilted him, and the heartbroken Myers became a recluse. He moved into a tiny room at the top of the building where, alone with his memories, he lived day after day, never seeing a living soul and only ever coming out at night to walk through the rooms by candlelight. The flickering flame of the candle cast a dull glow from the house's windows by night as he drifted from room to room. In 1873, the local council sued him for failing to pay his rates. He failed to appear in court, but the magistrate excused him on account of the fact the house in which he lived in was known as the Haunted House. In 1879, the magazine A Mayfair published an article about the property stating that the house was in a state of great decay, with windows caked and blackened by dust, full of silence and emptiness, and yet with no notice about it anywhere that it may be had for renting. This is known as the Haunted House in Berkeley Square. The article goes on to tell several ghost stories about the property, which have over the years found their way into countless books and articles about haunted London. One tells of a man who moved in with his 2 teenage daughters, the eldest of which immediately complained of a strange musty smell that, she said, was rather like of the animal's cage at the zoo. Later, the elder girl's fiancé, a Captain Kentfield, was due to visit the house, and a maidservant was asked to prepare his room. No sooner had she gone upstairs to do so than the household heard terrified screams coming from the room. Rushing to assist, they found her collapsed on the floor, muttering to herself, "Don't let it touch me." They were unable to ascertain exactly what it was, as the girl died in the hospital the following day. Unperturbed by the fate of the servant girl, Captain Kenfield announced that he would spend the night in the room. He duly headed upstairs by candlelight, and the household heard him close the door. 30 minutes later, terrible screams were heard coming from the room, followed by a gunshot. They rushed to his aid, but found him dead on the floor, his face twisted in horror. Evidently, something evil lurked in the ether of this room at number 50 Berkeley Square, and Charles Harper in Haunted Houses whetted his readers' appetites by melodramatically describing it as an unnamed raw head and bloody bones. Harper goes on to tell of a man who was skeptical and practical, and who before retiring to bed had given instructions to those who occupied the rest of the house that in the dead of night, if he were to ring the bell once, they were to take no notice, as he might simply be a little nervous without due cause. But if he were to ring twice, then they must come immediately to him. So saying, he retired to bed. All was quiet at first, but when the clock chimed midnight, there was a single ring on the bell. As per his instructions, they ignored it, but suddenly the bell began to ring furiously, and racing to his room, they found the man in convulsions of absolute terror. Like the earlier maidservant, he was unable to say what he had seen, and he too died shortly after. This massive and foreboding tower is the oldest of the buildings and dwarfs others around it. Wandering through its massive galleries and winding stone corridors is eerie even during the day. At night, when the floorboards are settling and the shadows lengthening, it must take nerves of steel to walk alone inside the building. But the custody guards, whose job it is to do just that, are a fearless bunch, although many of them have encountered strange phenomena. A white lady who once stood at a window, waving to a group of children, and whose wraith now drifts silently around the rooms, is just one of many spectres. Perhaps it is her cheap perfume that has been smelt around this entrance to St. John's Chapel, causing many a custody guard to retch at his pungent aroma. Guards passing from the chapel into the gallery containing Henry VIII's armor have spoken of a terrible crushing sensation that suddenly descends upon them, but which lifts the moment they stagger, shaking from the room. One guard patrolling through here in the early hours of a stormy winter morning got a sudden and unnerving sensation that a black cloak had been hung over his head. As he struggled, the cloak was seized from behind by his phantom assailant and pulled tight around his throat. When he arrived at the guardroom, after freeing himself, gasping and choking, the marks on his neck bore vivid testimony to his brush with the unseen horror. Another guard, Mr. Arthur Crick, decided to rest for a moment one night. As he made his rounds, sitting on an edge, he slipped off his right shoe when a voice behind him whispered, "There's only you and I here," eliciting from Arthur the very earthly response, "Just let me get this bloody shoe on, and there'll only be you." The phantom hitchhiker reputedly haunts the Blackwell Tunnel, which runs under the River Thames between Greenwich and Tower Hamlets in London. The usual account of a motorcyclist picking up the hitchhiker in 1972 seems to have changed slightly over time. In some versions, the hitchhiker is male, others female. Some accounts of the hitchhiker being picked up at the entrance to the south entrance of the North Tunnel, others within the tunnel itself. Either way, the hitchhiker got on the back of the bike asking for a lift to Leigh-on-Sea in Essex. Before the motorcyclist exited the tunnel on the northern bank of the river, the passenger had disappeared. The biker feared that the passenger had fallen off and tried desperately to find him or her, but found no trace. The following day, the motorcyclist visited the Leigh-on-Sea address the hitchhiker had given him and discovered that his passenger had actually died years before. Sometimes the hitchhiker is described as being in biker's leathers and referred to as being the ghost of someone who died in or just outside the tunnel in a motorbike accident during the 1960s. Apparently, the hitchhiker has been picked up on several occasions. It is heard of a letter published in the Fortean Times, 1994, where a reader described an incident in 1960 whilst he was staying in Blackwell Lane near the tunnel. He claimed that his father-in-law, his wife, and himself heard an accident outside, and upon investigating, found that a motorcyclist had been killed. 1 week later, he heard the same accident sound again with his wife at 2 a.m., but there was no sign of another accident or anything to explain the noise. Therefore, maybe a phantom accident also haunts the Blackwell Tunnel. The Spaniards Inn is an ancient, mostly unmodernized pub that lies almost forlornly on an outer edge of London's famous Hampstead Heath. There have for long been reports of ghostly happenings at the pub, not least of a shadowy figure that wanders around the upper rooms of the pub, which it seems to favour in preference to the bar area downstairs. The ghost is sometimes said to be that of Dick Turpin, who supposedly visited the inn and whose cloaked spectre has also been reported riding noiselessly across the heath. But this could just be wild speculation, considering that it is often a common tendency to identify many ghostly figures with characters from local legends, particularly if those are seen to have had some connection, as Turpin did, to a haunted place in question. This aside, it remains a fact that some shadowy figure or form has been reported at the Spaniards Inn, and in all probability would probably be found to predate Turpin's reign by many centuries. But to return to modern times, the last few years have brought many accounts of ghostly activity at the pub from management and visitors alike. The basic theme perhaps being that some definite psychic intelligence is active there, as recently as the autumn of 2003, for example. And this period involved a nightly vigil spent in the pub. Live-in bar staff reported outbreaks of ghostly activity upstairs, and although no figure was actually witnessed, sudden drops of temperature accompanied by the sound of invisible footsteps and the mysterious yet deliberate movement of objects seemed to suggest that some presence was active there. One girl, 26-year-old Manila Murad from San Paulo, actually swore that some invisible force walked around her bedroom early one morning and eventually immobilized her in the bed. She was unable to move, although equally too afraid to open her eyes to search for some explanation in the darkness. It was following these recent accounts that the author of this account was called in by the pub management to see if he could offer any explanation to these fresh outbreaks of ghostly activities. I arrived at the pub one Sunday evening in September around 9 p.m. and before long was listening to the accounts of two of the barmaids in a communal living room upstairs. Manila Murad was perhaps, as also Alexandra, the assistant manager who also lived on the premises. Basically, they both related accounts of the sound of an unexplained footsteps in their rooms at night, of objects being mysteriously moved or disturbed. Two pictures hanging on Manila's wall had been decentralized on their hooks, while a towel when she saw this happen, lifted from its rail and fell to the floor as if dislodged by some unseen hand. And being awoken by sudden drops of temperature in their rooms, whilst simultaneously something shook their beds. Invariably, on the occasions that this happened, both women had an overbearing impression that some sinister intelligence was actually visiting their respective rooms, and each snuggled up beneath the bedclothes to save perhaps having to witness their unwelcome nightly visitor. Around 11:30 p.m., after having taken detailed notes of both girls' experiences, it was arranged that I spend a nightly vigil in Alexandra's room, a place where the psychic activity had been especially potent. After inspecting the room and taking thermal readings, I laid back on a covered but comfortable large bed, camera and wits at the ready to await any developments. Nothing untoward happened until 1:12 a.m. when, for no apparent reason, one of the candles I was using for light flared up in a matter of moments in the absence of any apparent drought, went out completely. Then at exactly 1:38, the lampshade on the central room light began to swing quite violently, but again investigation revealed no apparent cause for this strange anomaly. It was 3:23 that an event occurred that seemed to defy any plausible explanation. From my position on the bed, I could clearly see the bedroom door and the light from a dimly lit corridor outside that illuminated a small gap at its base. There was no sound, but at this time, this light was briefly but definitely blacked out, as though something or someone had walked past. A quick check of the corridor revealed nothing, and inquiries over breakfast the next morning revealed that nobody in the pub owned either a dog or a cat. Casual coincidence or the possible continuation of some ghostly activity. It is unlikely that the Spaniards Inn, after so many years, will be quickly forthcoming in giving up its ghostly stories. There have been some ghostly goings-on out in the East End, and there's a truly sad history behind them. Workers at Bethnal Green Station have heard children sobbing, women screaming, and the general sound of panic. This starts quietly and then rises to the sound of a cacophony, leaving anyone who hears it understandably terrified. It can all be traced back to a dark night in March 1943. As one of the deepest stations in East London, Bethnal Green was doubling as an air raid shelter when the Luftwaffe circled for an attack. Hearing sirens, residents streamed down the steps into the supposed safety of the station. Tragedy struck when an anti-aircraft gun went off nearby and started a panicked rush, which led to a stampede. 173 people died in the ensuing crash, and the screams still echo around Bethnal Green today.